Your Majesty, thank you so much for joining me here at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And of course, it's in person this year after a few years of having to go virtual because of the pandemic. How do you feel it's changed over the last few years, and what are some of the messages that you're hearing?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm extremely happy to be here in person. Like you said, we've been the last 2 years trying to connect through Zoom and links and Teams, and it is not the same. Of course, you will speak to the people you need to speak, but you miss a bit being able to communicate what the issues are, and other people listening, and they would not be the usual suspects. And they could have an interest. So in my field of work, which is financial inclusion, and I help the WEF basically with a couple of initiatives on this front, the pandemic has been of course, very negative for a lot of people, but also very positive in the sense that a lot of countries that have actually had been hearing about this financial inclusion, what we've actually been doing, that through mobile phones you can get an account by which this person can actually get payments or even credit or even insurance. A lot of governments, when the pandemic and the lockdown started, said, oh my God, this is the way for us to send money to the poorest and the most vulnerable people, that they had to stay in lockdown, they couldn't go to the markets and sell their produce. And this was a very important issue. So many countries have increased this, I would say, government to people payments in these 2 years. And they've actually discovered this financial inclusion tool to actually do a lot more of their, goals that they are trying to attain.
Those are the positive outcomes, Your Majesty, but what is the scale, do you think, of the problem today, and who is most affected?
Well, we've been doing a lot of work in the last years. We've actually increased 1.5 billion people, but we probably have 1.5 billion people more to go. And I say probably because the new numbers are going to come up in June. So I know that we've advanced, but we don't know exactly for how much. And what I think is very interesting to see is what happened also within the pandemic, you've actually seen the trend as well before, is that, certainly around the cities and certainly, men have actually been having more access. The ones that are lagging behind are the rural, smallholder farmers, women, the very small SMEs, the M side of the MSMEs, and of course the more vulnerable and poor. So, and certainly after this pandemic, we even have seen groups of women that actually are less connected to the internet, because between the money to spend to actually have a phone and to put, food on the table, well, they chose for putting food on the table. So there is a very big connection between, the affordability and accessibility to digital solutions as well, to be able to have people financially included.
How concerned are you about this financial global divide?
Well, very. If you see sort of the last 2 years, what, this pandemic had actually put much more people in extreme poverty. And now what is going to actually happen with the increase of prices and fertilizers, and what that actually mean? I mean, we're going to be seeing now because of that inflation, but we're going to be seeing also in the next year, because when you don't have fertilizers, you cannot increase your yield. So therefore, you're going to see less produce coming out from Africa, which actually feeds each other there. So you're going to have less food. So the prices are probably going to go up even more. So very worrying. So therefore, and also climate change. Climate change also is one of the issues that fit the most vulnerable the most, because they don't have the mitigation tools to actually defend themselves. They don't have enough insurance. They don't have enough savings if, if they have sort of a drought or a flood. So it is very important that those people we actually reach with, financial inclusion, and with the products that will actually increase their resilience, that we can actually give them subsidies if it's needed, and to help them out, revamp their production when it's in the agricultural sector.
What kinds of fintech and other innovative ideas and technology can help?
Well, I have to tell you, without technology, we would not have been able to reach the billions of people we're being able to reach now, and with the types of products. So Fintech, therefore, can actually play a very good role. Why? Because they think differently, and they can really listen to the needs of the population and actually design products that really cater to those needs. One fantastic example I have is, until now, how do you do that a household that is poor can actually have access to a solar panel? Well, there is a company company now that actually decided, well, what I can do now is with the money that would actually daily spend for a jerry can of kerosene, that same installment they can actually pay to buy a solar panel. And after 6 months, they own that solar panel and they have an asset. So that it's like they actually save. So the great thing about this, without technology, that daily payment would have been impossible. And organizing that whole market would have been impossible. And of course, we started in the pilot phase, but now it's actually millions. So these type of collaborations, which is investing in opportunities, off-grid electricity, sustainability, and actually getting an asset to this poor household, is what basic technology makes possible. Now, a caveat is, in order for technology to work properly, to keep on being inclusive and safe, we have to have digital public goods. We have to have a digital ID. Without an ID, you cannot open an account. Without connectivity, and everybody thinks that everybody has a cell phone, and that's not really the case. And not everywhere you can actually get signs, so connectivity is a big issue. Also having interoperable payment systems so that one system from one bank and a mobile phone speaks to the other. So, you could really make it a competitive system. All these issues are extremely important, and also not to forget algorithm biases. An algorithm looks at past patterns and tends to repeat those in the future. So women never had access to credit. In the future, they will have even probably less access to credit. So we need to study this issue of algorithm biases. Certainly we'll start applying AI to see how we can avoid these algorithm biases so that we can really not exclude more people with technology, but rather include.
Who would you like to actually say this is what has to be done?
Well, I think collaboration and actually speaking to each other is a very important issue. We've actually tried to get, for example, a working group on algorithm bias by many practitioners. And it was actually, some of them had different solutions for it. Some of them, it's like it is on the coding. Some of them actually, they had a comparable data set to see, are we really servicing the people we really want to serve that is coming out from the algorithm? And so there are different tools, but we still don't know what is the champion of the tools, and maybe we're going to have 3 or 4 tools, but we have to be in this learning phase. So my point here is, please let us get together, be mindful there will be an algorithm bias that might actually exclude more than include, and start to learn from each other how to come about this and really make it inclusive for everybody.
Do you think collaboration is possible, Your Majesty? Can you tell me about the CEO Partnership for Economic Inclusion and how the private sector can help address these issues?
Well, I think collaboration is not only from public and private, because I think in that sense this should actually be spoken with the regulators around the world, but also private and private collaboration. So we've actually in what we call the COP is actually a set of companies that they are also very they really want to support this whole issue of financial inclusion. And some of them are retailers and they have consumer products. Some of them are mobile operators. Some of them are banks. Some of them are insurers. And what they do is they work together to get to the last mile. Because getting to the last mile is quite expensive. But if a company like, for example, Unilever, they have a tremendous amount of distribution in all the little merchants that actually buy their shampoos and their products. But, these people do not have access to credit, do not have access to a payment system. So we can actually put together a mobile phone and a bank next to each other, next to Unilever, and that's what we actually did. It's basically you're banking that merchant, by which this is not CSR. This increases the business proposition for both the 3 companies, but they do have to cooperate together.
Can they still improve their own bottom line?
Well, I don't think that these collaborations, you could do it in the short term, that there's a huge amount of cross-subsidy between departments, but in the end of the day, it has to be commercially viable, enterprise. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get the millions of people, because otherwise we'll stay where we've actually been doing until now, which is we reach 20,000 farmers or 20,000 merchants, pilot, but we never get out of the pilot, and we don't get the scale that we really need to really make change.
With all the crises that our world is facing today, Your Majesty, do you feel that financial inclusion is a priority?
Well, let's be put it that. If I say, between having a phone and a bank account and having a meal, of course, you will actually say you will have to have a meal. But financial inclusion is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So what if you invest in financial inclusion, what you're going to do is you end up giving this family a possibility to go to school, to get, have livelihoods, to be able to invest in their future so they can actually have more income to actually have more meals. So it is a means to an end. So I wouldn't say it's competing. It is definitely a priority, and it's definitely a part of the infrastructure of any society to make actually progress in an equal manner.
Of course, we are seeing conflict right on the doorsteps of Europe. How concerned are you?
Certainly, the concern is not only the conflict in and by itself, but in my role as financial inclusion for development, which is I want to reduce poverty, I want more girls to go to school, I want more people to have better futures. An increase of food prices or the magnitude we're seeing of energy prices basically will do that a lot of families are going to have from 3 or 2 meals a day to have 1 meal a day, and this in turn will actually probably will be the source of even more stability in other regions. So that worries me a lot. So that is why it is really very important that we continue to be investing in this financial inclusion, but also working on how do we get fertilizers that actually the prices have been heightened to the smallholder farmers so they can keep on producing in the same years they used to do before their produce, so we can keep on feeding the people so as to avoid this kind of instability we might actually have in the future. Just to give an example.
Can I ask you why this role is so important for you personally?
Well, because I was born in a country, Argentina, that I've seen, given sort of the back and forth in their economic situation, that we needed to really empower the people to really make the best of what they were actually out of the incomes and the situation. And I've realized that the power of financial inclusion is enormous in that sense. And with that, and if we actually pair it to health access, to maybe the opportunity to being able to make investments on sustainability, or even protect yourself against unforeseen risks, sickness or a drought. I think that is the most important thing, because how many times we've actually seen people getting out of poverty, but they go back into poverty every time there's an external shock. So resilience is also a very big issue. So in this sense, also for development economies, there is this notion that I really like to talk about, which is the issue of financial health. Today, in OECD countries, 50% of all respondents have actually said they have financial stress. In the US, one out of 3 employees have financial stress. So this gives you a little bit the magnitude that it's not a question of income, it's a question of cash flow management. And what are the perks we actually give the customers so they can actually really improve the financial health of their families. Without this, I'm afraid that we're not going to be able to actually get a lot of people to go with us in the humongous transitions we have to do. If it's energy transition, sustainability, flexibility in the workforce. So we really, really need to focus on these financial health issues. And there are very good ways of actually doing it. The private sector can do a lot when you have sort of, employees that are actually having financial stress. You can do a lot in terms of, coach them and how to sort of manage their cash flows. You can also do something about their incomes. Governments can also do a lot, but they have to sort of measure it and see what are the policies that actually help or not. So one of the big issues is also financial health.
Would you like governments to do more?
Yes, but governments alone cannot do it. So I think the collaboration between the private and the public sector is extremely important. I mean, there's a role for government in actually setting up regulations, also helping sometimes in the cooperation between different ministries, setting up, good controls when there's, for example, credit products that are actually really not good for the population. But at the same time, it's also the private sector that should also be looking into is this product really improving people's financial lives? Am I getting them into more indebtedness? Am I increasing their buffers, their savings, so that they can actually sort of overcome these external shocks? These are the questions we have to pose ourselves.
Just finally, Your Majesty, are you hopeful for a more equitable world, and will we see it in our lifetime?
Well, the whole world may be too big for me, but definitely on my subjects, I've actually seen so much progress. And I've seen it, I go to countries every 3 years, and I see, starting to a country like I went to Pakistan, and I see it sort of 6 years later, and then I see the same women with a mobile phone, and then being able to get information, the prices that actually they're selling, so they can actually bargain with a buyer, or they can actually start sending their kids to school, or they used to they'd be self-employed and all of a sudden have 5 employees. Well, that gives me a lot of hope, because with that we can actually engage them to do a lot more for themselves and their communities.
Your Majesty, thank you so much for joining me here in Davos.
Thank you very much.